Hey everyone, welcome to our first audio story video. These videos will typically run like an audiobook. There'll be narrations as well as voice parts. Additionally, some of these stories will be self-contained to a single video, while others will span multiple chapters. These videos are meant to be useful for forming an adventure, getting ideas for your own written work, and simply for your entertainment. Seeing as most of the experience is listening in this story, the screen will just simply have a background and nothing significant besides our protagonist. Have a listen, and I hope you enjoy our first story. Now, before we begin, there are a few things of note about this story in particular. One thing you should know is that this story is heavily influenced by D&D elements and creatures. As such, you may not immediately know what a named creature is, however, I have tried to explain with a brief example. Additionally, while I did rewrite some parts of the story to improve consistency, a large portion of this was written in my high school to college years, when I was not as refined with my writing. In the future, these stories will be from my more recent work, and as such, hopefully an improvement in writing will be evident. It may also help to understand that this story is written in a Warhammer 40K kind of Space Marines with melee weapons kind of setting. Royt, the Dread Commander, a D&D inspired story. Over the years, the Dread Commander Royt had built a bit of a reputation of being the most intelligent, strategic, and loyal defensive commander. He had saved the lives of thousands of men with his defensive-based strategies. Year after year, the number of men he saved grew into the thousands. He was soon recognized for his great deeds and was put in charge of the most dangerous mission the Corps had ever dealt with. The Corps is the military branch which oversees the missions that extend into space and against other species. On this mission, Roy was allowed to pick his own army and the leaders who will command his troops. A man of loyalty and honor, he chose the men and women who owed him the greatest debts, the ones whose lives had been saved by the Dread Commander's courageous actions. He has saved some of them from the darkest moments of their lives. As such, he knew they owed him their lives. It was the debt that he relied on to improve the odds of success. He outfit his soldiers with the most advanced gear and communication devices left for the mission. As they left for launch, he gave an speech which instilled his trust in everyone's capability and the vision of a great victory over their enemies. Although Royt was an exceptional commander, he was unable to ever carry that confidence over to his social life. Now, while this is a brief story about the commander, it's important that we include this part as these flaws will show themselves often and in dire moments. Being a man of such greatness, one would imagine the commander seasoned in the art of love. Unfortunately, that was just not the case. A story comes to mind of a time when he had heroically protected a succubus who had been beaten in the street by some civilians. The succubus was so thankful for his kindness, especially because, as we all know, the succubus is a cruel species that is not allowed inside the capital of Nirvan. The succubus offered her aid to the commander as repayment for saving her life. He allowed this as he trusted she would aid him one day as he had aided her. Ignorantly, Roy mistook her succubus's kindness as something more and attempted to woo her. The succubus, of all people, refused him, saying that she could never see him that way after he put his life on the line, killing a civilian. Being crushed that he was turned down by a succubus, one of the most sexually voracious creatures in existence, he went into a fit of emotional depression. After this day, Wright was never fully in sync with his gear. This had the side effect of causing malfunctioning with his life and energy regulators. As you may also remember, as I mentioned before, the suits our soldiers wear into combat this day make full use of the soldier's self. As such, soldiers need to maintain a balanced life to achieve balance in combat. The love he had for this succubus would end up eating him from the inside out, which is a bit ironic as that's usually the opposite of how a succubus ruins one's life. Royt's mission was not the nature he was used to. He was going to be leading an assault team into an area that held a group of hostile, mind-altering beings. He felt unnerved to be running on a plan opposite of what he was usually commanding. However, it was the whispers of what these creatures were capable of that truly scared him. Being still mentally unstable from his attempts to find a compatible mate, he feared going into a field of mind warpers, as they had self-nicknamed themselves, and he thought it to be dangerous. He only took comfort in knowing that his team was composed of the most mentally stable and well-trained Marines, along with his commanders, who he personally knew were all well prepared for the job. As the men walked off their deployment cruisers, they instantly felt the effects of the mind warpers. Out of the platoon of 100,000 men, 20 had their brains explode upon touching the planet's soil. As for the rest of the men, they began strong, but after days of four vicious assaults against the most agile, maniacal creatures they had ever fought, a few others began to babble incoherently. Royt fought right in the front lines among his men and continued to do what he did best, save lives. His commanders led the Marines without fear and with total clarity. After a siege of 3 days, the Marines had made a significant dent on the enemy's lines and stronghold. Royt had lost only 2,300 men at this point, and he was proud of his accomplishments. He was glad to see his plans work on the assault, and was confident that his victory would be assured. He sent his men out one day without him, as he needed to rest and plan future attack strategies. After the extended period of restless assault, he quickly found himself wrapped up in his sleeping gear, passed out from exhaustion. He dreamt of many things, but at the root of his dreams were always those of settling down and being in a loving relationship with another like himself, strong but weak at heart. He awoke to find out that one of his commanders was attempting to lead his men into a trap. He struck the commander down and removed his head as a symbol of what will happen if you turn on him. Justified in his actions, still, Royt felt concerned that maybe his commanders had been affected by the mind warpers. Royt, having noticed another one of his commanders had allowed his mind to be tainted, let his heavy fist lay into the commander's face, causing the trance to be broken. After 10 days at combat, the battle shifted to a standstill. The Marines would get a push going, but then as they neared their goal, they would become weakened and forced to retreat. The Dread Commander's forces still rested in the tens of thousands, but he could feel the tension among his men. The following day, Royt employed his most ingenious plan yet. These plans led to his men reaching the gates of the enemy fortress with losing minimal men from battle wounds and mental disruption along the way. As they stood positioned at the gate of the enemy, they planned for the following day's infiltration. The Dread Commander was suddenly caught off guard when he heard the voice of the Mind Warper's general inside his head. The leader explained that it wanted to speak in person about a peaceful end to this war. Seeing a possible way of better understanding something he did not know, the Dread Commander allowed for the meeting to take place, in hopes of a truce. At the very least, Roy planned to learn more about the fortress he would have to siege if the meeting were to go south. The leader was a Mind Flayer, with a skull double the size of the normal Mind Flayer. These beings were often known to be dark and twisted, which led their prey into traps via mind control and used their tentacles to remove the brains from the skull. This being before him, though, looked nothing of the sort. By far the most shocking part of seeing the leader was that it was a she. Royd had heard that only a few female mind flayers still existed after the purging attempts made by the prior ruling board of the Corps. She pled with Royt to end his assault, as the Corps was using him just to retrieve an artifact. The relic was powerful, and the Corps wished to obtain it, as the relic could revive any being by simply uttering the name into the relic. It was a valuable item to obtain. Royt was very loyal to the Corps, and he could not believe that they would be doing something for gain, and not defensive reasons. He would need time to process this, and should update the soldiers outside. He returned to his men 12 hours after he had gone in to negotiate, and his mood was off. The men noticed it, and so did his most trusted commanders. He said for 48 hours there'll be a ceasefire, and no one is to provoke any attacks or start any fighting, till he can figure out a plan to work with the leader and with the Corps. He then promptly grabbed his gear and communication module and returned to the Mind Flayer's tower. He called command to question the intent of the war, and explained that the Mind Warpers would be willing to make a settlement. Command would only say that the Mind Flayer, who Roy had learned was named Maulinda, was too dangerous to be kept alive, and that the device they possessed ended lives instead of returning them. Roy could not believe either Command or Maulinda. Both stories were possible. The commander, being vigilant at finding the truth, remained in the tower for another 12 hours, checking everything he could on both sides of the argument, and researching the crystal, now identified as the Shard of Gorni. He was working another long day. He hadn't slept in 2 days at this point, and was growing rather sleepy as he researched all he could. Melinda offered him to sleep beside her in her bed, which was 5 times larger than the room the two would take up. He knew he would not do his best work if he remained in this condition, and was not wishing to anger the Mind Flayer, so he nestled into the bed next to Melinda, who was planning on taking a rest herself. He found the situation rather odd. However, he was tired, and figured that maybe, in Mind Flayer culture, one did not think two enemies sharing a bed in a time with peace was so odd. Although tired, Roy could not fall asleep, as he felt uncomfortable sleeping next to his enemy, and to make it worse, a woman, which made him even more uncomfortable. At some point, he must have fell asleep for a few minutes, as he awoke to find Melinda lying on top of him, pinning his legs with hers. "What are you doing? If you break this peace treaty, your world will be destroyed." "I meant no harm in what I was doing. I only wished to relieve the stress we both suffer from. I know we both suffer the stress of the long combat, harmful leadership, and the lack of anyone to comfort them at home or at war." Roy quickly pushed Melinda off her balance and rolled on top of her, pinning her leg with his as she had just done to him. Melinda let out a happy chuckle, and prepared for the happiness she had dreamed of over the years of never-ending fighting. But sadly, to her disapproval, Roy rolled off and repressed his feelings. He so greatly wanted to enjoy himself for once and relieve all this built-up rage and stress. He lay on the far side of the bed, head spinning, as he tried to make sense of everything before him. She is my enemy's leader, but what if she is telling the truth? Melinda, realizing the conflict that Roy was likely dealing with, rolled over to him again, but this time simply lay next to him as she whispered in his ear, "It's all right. You need not feel afraid. Please make the decision you feel comfortable with." Roy was eager to let his urges beat him, and to allow the beautiful Mind Flayer to have her way with him. He could not make a choice, and meanwhile Melinda continued to whisper all these positive things in his ear. As she did this, she also began to slowly remove her ceremonial robe. Roy, far too deep in thought, even notice that Melinda now lay next to him, naked, revealing her beautiful body, and the moonlight sparkled off of it a nice baby blue. Royt turned to make his final judgment, and was instantly overcome by the sheer beauty of Melinda. He could not control himself, as the two intertwined under the covers. This kept up for several hours, neither wanting to stop the enjoyment. Eventually, they were both satisfied by this dream come true, and the two of them fell immediately to sleep. The next time they both woke, they would not be as happy as when they had fallen asleep. The first to wake up was Royt, who after much confusion recalled what had transpired the night before. He attempted to get up, and upon doing so woke Melinda, who wanted to remain cuddling for just a little bit longer. He was very sleepy still, and he allowed this, though he thought it odd how human-like she was. The two snuggled up together, and Roy felt that brief happiness he had felt last night re-emerge. They enjoyed each other's touch, and wished that they could stay in that bed for a lifetime, to preserve those feelings. They got up an hour later, and Roy reported in to his squad, and then command. Royt said that he felt that the Mind Warpers deserve to live in peace, as he believes the device they possess is not that of a destroying galaxy, but merely a trinket or shrine to their people. He had seen and verified this truth when he tested the crystal this morning. The command refused to take his word for it, and requested that the Mind Warpers either give over the relic or be overrun. Melinda said that without the relic, the other Mind Flayers and Mind Warpers would refuse to work and be productive. The removal of the stone would cause chaos among all this world's beings. Roy, much enjoying Melinda's company, offered to remain behind at the tower and personally see that the shard never gets used for more than covering the Mind Warpers. The command sensed something off in his response, and demanded that he come out of the fortress and talk among his army of the course of actions. As he returned to the HQ, he explained his involvement with Melinda, wisely excluding their nighttime activity, as it would have caused question of his judgment. Still, the others felt he was mentally unstable, and decided he was unfit to lead this expedition any longer. He would have refused to lead it had they let him. Storming out of the HQ, he notified his commanders of the corruption he had experienced from the core, and that he would be staying with Melinda and the Mind Flayers. I will see that your men leave or defend the fortress till the last Marine dies at the gates. You will falter without my strong leadership, and if you attack, I know all the weaknesses to exploit. You know how good I am at defending something, so I advise you find a way to convince the Corps that they should let you leave this planet, for both our sakes. Upon reaching this fortress, he quickly readied the Mind Warper troops' genius strategy for stopping an attack if one was ever issued. He set up traps and flanking situations so that the odds of his success were far higher than the Marines. After great preparation, he returned to the top of the tower, where Melinda sat worried by the chants echoing from outside. Roy grabbed his communications relay and headed into her throne room. For hours he attempted to reason with his soldiers for a peaceful way to end this, so that he could remain with the Mind Warpers, but also ensure that both sides remained safe. The command only saw the apprehension of the crystal as a way to end the war. Roy, realizing he could not reason with the command, prepared for the worst, but before cutting his radio, he spoke a rather odd statement. You are all just enraged by the fact that there's part of this world left that still has dignity and peace. You want to come and destroy it because if you can't have it, then you want no one to have it. I finally can see a path where my life goes on after this war, and you hate me for finding it. Royt then took his powerful sword and cut the radio in two. So for 4 years, the battle raged on. Neither side won. Many lives were lost on both sides, and yet in all that time, the Marines had not pushed past the front gate. Every day, Roy would wake up, go outside the gate with the 5 most elite fighters of the Mind Warpers, and kill men he had once called brothers. The psionic field that was produced around him by the other prophetic mind flayers back at the tower made it so he was untouchable. Although to the soldiers having no idea of this, Royt just seemed to be invincible. Halfway through the 4 years, Royt was growing tired of his daily routine. He decided that he could end it if he could remove the leaders. Under the cover of night, he returned to the base headquarters, passing thousands of Marines without being noticed. He walked into the commander's quarter, being an honest, fair fighter, awoke the 8 commanders. They pleaded with him to come back and to end the war, but he blamed the Corps for the war now, and told them that if they had any wish to live, that they fail to leave this planet, or he would personally see to it that they met their end here. The commanders he had once trusted his life with, and that had trusted their lives with him, stared into the now red eyes of Royt, confused. Litter, his most trusted commander, walked up to him and laid down his weapon at his feet. He then stood up and spoke. Roy, you have been everything to me for so long. You are a friend to me, an ally, a savior. But if you're going to throw away everything we had for a woman and what you call happiness, then I'm going to stop you. However, Roy, as a loyal fighter, you also know that I cannot let you do this. So here's your one chance to strike me down. Pick up your sword and fight me like a man. An odd, strange voice came out. I refuse to raise my axe towards the man I called captain so many times before. Pick up your sword. Someone, strike me. Why do you just stand there staring and being worthless? Roy, in a fury, began punching the walls. He did not want to be dishonorable. Against his best judgment, he raised his sword and began to swing at Litter. Rael caught his blade mid-swing and knocked him to the floor. He had always respected her great strength, but right now it only angered him. She held his arms down as he attempted to strike her off. She talked to him for several minutes, still restraining him along with other commanders. I admit I regret my actions of late, but I do not want to venture out of the tower every day and slaughter our men. But the people inside are good people. They are friendly and kind. I do not wish to harm either side, but I have to protect Melinda. Rael, after knowing she had calmed him down, allowed his hands to be free. Roy, why do your eyes glow so red like hateful pyres? Roy peered into the mirror, and in doing so, saw nothing. He looked, but all he saw was his regular calm blue eyes. This discrepancy got a thought floating through his mind. Maybe the Corps had brainwashed his commanders, and maybe they think him as the bad guy now. Uneasily, he reached for his sword. In a crazed rage, Royt swung wildly as the commanders protected themselves from him. A few minutes later, Royt walked out of the door of the command quarters, covered in blood, and a pale look on his face. Over his shoulder he carried one of the commanders. The onlooking army was unsure if the commander was dead or alive. Not a single man dared to step in front of Royt as he passed through the camp. Later that day, discovered by a poor Marine Grade 1, was the horrid sight of 6 corpses strewn across the bunker. The Corps was enraged by these assassinations, and forced retaliation by storming the fort with full force. Roy flawlessly commanded the mine warpers in creating a field that fried the minds of all Marines walking in the gate of the fort. After 10,000 Marines had been killed, the men retreated, seeing the impregnability of the fort. The command, or what was left of them, sat down to discuss plans for retreat or an attempt to reason with the lost Royt. The Corps decided that either an assassination attempt on Royt or the Queen would be the best military strategy. or a full-out retreat would be all that was left. They were very worried about sending a single woman out to do a job a whole army could not, but they had faith that she was the best in the business, or at least that is since Royce changed sides. And seeing as she was the only commander who lived the onslaught at the base 2 years before, she was poised for revenge. Nejd scaled the tower quickly, without any mental trouble, as she was the most stable individual in the entire corps. She caught the two sleeping in the bed, completely alone, and with no troublesome guards in her way. As she approached, moving silently, she went to go slit Royt's throat. But as she went to press the blade against his neck, she couldn't go through with it. She, like many others, had known Royt for his deeds, and he had once saved her life. She slinked over to Melinda and prepared to strike, now having no feelings in her heart, only hatred towards the Queen for turning Royt from the man he was to her side. She began to lunge, but as she did, her arm was quickly thrust back, and Royt held her in his arms, constricting her from movement. He yelled to awake the Queen, and then turned the assassin towards him to see her face from underneath the hood she wore. As he pulled back the hood, he was brought to tears. He had not seen Nejd in 10 years, and in his rage he had not even noticed her at the commander bunker. She was one of the few women who he had always respected for her similar personality and military prowess. He cautioned Melinda to leave him to talk to the assassin. When Melinda was out of the room, he instantly fell to the floor weeping into Nejd's legs. She bent down to comfort him and tried to reason with him and understand his situation. He explained it all, and the two talked for hours, without interruption, about his predicament, and attempted to find a common ground that the both of them could bring back to command and have peace at last. Roy explained his plan to settle this place. This was just to allow peace between the two nations. All would be forgotten, and they would work together. They would also leave the relic, and he would be put in charge of making sure everything remained regular. He would be pardoned of his assassinations, as long as he returned the prisoner he had taken. He walked out with Nejd, holding Ryle in his arms. The Marines allowed them through, and the three returned to HQ. The Corps command accepted the request, except they expressed that in order to remind him of his mistakes, he must live the rest of his life with his armor being imprinted with 6 red markings, the symbols of the 6 commanders and friends he had slain in his time of weakness. He allowed his armor to be scorched with these cursed marks, and he returned to the spire to tell Melinda of the news and report that Nejd and Ryle would be staying with him to make sure that the crystal is kept under watch, and so that their minds would not be tainted, as the three of them would sense each other's change in personality. The dropships began to evacuate the Marines who were left, and plans for a base to be made to keep watch over the planet and start a society between the two forces was put into the works. As the three friends reached the top of the fortress, they fell upon a sight that was both horrifying and gruesome. There was blood dripping from every item in the room, and the door to the Queen's quarter was locked, and they could hear screaming. Roy busted down the door in a fit of rage, fearing that the Corps had turned back on their plans. What he saw next would change his life forever. 2 mind flayers were helping to deliver what he would later learn was his son. It was a bloody mess of an alien, but Royt smiled the biggest smile of happiness a man could ever smile. He walked over to Melinda and held her hand as she writhed in the pain of afterbirth. He picked up his newborn son and raised him to his face to examine him. He was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, aside from the wonderful woman who had given him life. The room turned from a room filled with soldiers to a bunch of people in a joyful fit, each wanting to hold the child. Upon this day, Royt was observed carving in his armor the phrase "Enjoy the little things in life" on his left arm plate, and "Preserve the happiness and destroy those that try to harm it" on his right arm plate. Royt had finally succeeded in achieving both these goals, and some say from that day on you never saw him without a smile on his face. Royt lived 20 years after that day, before finally passing away. Royt died in the 5th season of harvest, under a starlit sky, with the biggest smile on his face, wearing his full armor. He was given the highest form of a military funeral, and his son was the one to send his coffin, as was tradition for decades. His armor still sits here in the Grand Training Center in Nirvan, where his story is told to every new cadet when they first begin their training, both as a reminder of what he inscribed on his armor and the marks that were placed there as punishment. Wow. I'm glad I finally was able to bring that to you all. Hopefully this story was entertaining and helped you get ideas for your own stories. If you liked what you saw, please share the channel and consider leaving a like. It really helps the channel grow. StoryCorps aims to be the #1 channel for fostering creative storytelling and for finding inspiration to make your own stories come to life. Have a wonderful day, and please subscribe if you want to see more content. Thank you.